So my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. And for those of you who weren't here earlier, this webinar is already very portentous because it did allow me to identify the fact that I have a pencil sharpener, which I've been looking for a year in my office right there. So if nothing else good comes out of this webinar, there is that one thing. So for those of you who don't know me or don't know what I do, county foresters in Vermont are our role. We've been around since the 1940s, and our role is to help the owners of privately owned forested land. So Vermont's about 75% forested. 80% of that land is privately owned, to help them manage their land responsibly. And we do that in a bunch of different ways. We manage a tax abatement program called the Current Use Program, which helps people, which lowers development pressure on people's lands, lowering their taxes and helping them manage their land better by making them manage in accordance with the forest management plan, which is developed by a licensed consulting forester and approved and monitored by the county forester. We're also just a free resource for everybody in our county. So if you have forested land, you can call us up and we'll go take a walk and we'll talk about what's going on in your woods and how to manage it responsibly if you want to. We also help towns in our county manage their municipal forests, town forests. And that's something that I really like to do. There's really, in Chittenden County, there's about a dozen of these. They cover about 4,200 acres, and they're all really amazing. And then the last part is what I call just sort of whatever. But what it really is being creative about how you elevate the quality of forest management and the health of forests in your county. And every county is different. Every community is different. And so how we address that is going to be really different from county to county, from town to town, from community to community. And that's sort of where we get to be creative and try and build something and try and help to establish a culture of better forest management and healthier forests in our county. And so in service to sort of that and also those other roles that I have, I've been really leaning into doing these virtual events. And so I'm really excited to see a lot of new names that I don't recognize here as we talk about one aspect of forest management. So tonight we're going to talk about managing forests in light of a changing climate and also for forest carbon. So with that, I am going to share my screen. If you do have questions, please plug them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end. So, minimize this. So here we are, managing for forests for carbon and climate change. And again, my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester I work for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, and that's my email. And so we're going to start with talking about the effects that climate change is having and will have on forests. So among many other things, so there's going to be a lot of different sort of feedbacks and parts to the way that this expresses itself and is going to continue to express itself. We can expect altered natural disturbance regimes. What that means is natural disturbances and stuff like precipitation occurring at different levels and with different frequencies. On the left, you see just some examples of that. Observed changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, heavy precipitation, frost-free, season length. With that, and also increasing temperatures, we expect the suitable ranges for our different tree species to change. So, whereas Vermont may be a really good place that's really well suited to a species like sugar maple, in a number of decades with climate change proceeding as it is, we expect it to be less well suited to Vermont. And that plays out, all tree species are different, so that plays out differently from species to species, but sugar maple is an example of one that we expect to become much less suitable. Does that mean that all the sugar maple is going to die right away? No, but it means that we would expect to see existing sugar maples which are more stressed, and in general, less and less sugar maple going forward. Some species are also expected to increase in frequency, so some of our southern species, especially our hickories and our oaks, are expected to increase in the region, or at least the suitability for them will increase, and we'll see over time probably an increase in the abundance of those species. There's a number of feedbacks with climate change, so we expect some increased threats to biodiversity. We expect conditions to become better for invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, stuff like deer, which is a native species, but the populations can get really out of control when we have stuff like less winter mortality, in addition to some other stuff like the fact that we've killed all their native predators, can be a really significant threat to biodiversity by the way that they browse our native species. And in just general, we see, you know, the way that our trees respond to stress is that you get, you know, one stressor, which is maybe not a big deal, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. We call it stacking stressors. And something that wasn't a big deal can easily become a very big deal. We expect stress on our ecosystems to increase in general. Okay. So in addition to all those effects of climate change, what we really talk about now is something called global change. So what global change is a recognition that in addition to our climate changes and all of the changes in our climate and all those things I just talked about, they are compounded by other stuff, other human-caused stressors, such as in Vermont, we have this legacy of past land clearing and the mismanagement of our forests, which has really altered the forests that we have. They're very young, simple, sometimes degraded. Invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens. Forest loss, the loss of areas of forests on areas that would traditionally be forested, their conversion to other uses, and their fragmentation, get them getting split up into smaller and smaller pieces. Pollution, global loss of biodiversity. We're losing biodiversity very quickly on this planet, and more. So in addition to all those climate changes, we also have all of these other stressors. And so we need to manage forests which are adaptive, which are able to adapt to changing conditions, however they express themselves, which are resilient, able to deal with all these different effects of these various stressors, and able to cope with these really fast-paced environmental changes that we expect in the future as our climate changes, and also as we continue to throw wrenches in the system with these human-created additional problems. And so we think about this, the way that we are going to help our forest adapt in a few different ways. There's sort of a bunch of different approaches we take. The more sort of conservative approach would be to increase the resistance of our forests. That lower left-hand slide says resistance, improve forest defenses against predicted changes or disturbance to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. So basically helping our forest resist the effects of those environmental changes. A step up, requiring a little bit more active response, but trying to roll with those changes a little bit more actively would be resilience. And that says accommodating some change, but encouraging a return to a prior or desired reference condition following disturbance. So basically helping our forests be more suited to changing, but then also be able to respond positively to change. And then on the more sort of progressive or active side of the spectrum is transition. So this would require us to actively facilitate change and encourage our ecosystems to adaptively respond to new conditions. So what this is three different sort of ways of thinking about the ways that we help our forest respond to climate change, global change. We can be either sort of very conservative and try and help our forests resist this as long as they can, or can be sort of progressive, helping our forests be more resilient, or actively helping them to transition to what we think is going to be a more suitable condition to a changed climate in the future. So what I really think about is sort of the middle path of that, encouraging resilient forests. So what resilient forests are is that, in sort of this modern forest management approach, we are changing out the idea of stability. That's that resistance. The idea that we want a forest that resists change by recognizing that without climate change, our forests, someone got to mute themselves. Even without a climate change, that our forests are dynamic and that they're changing all the time, and that to act to try and keep them from changing is sort of to keep them from being forests, to keep them from being dynamic, which is a really important part of how they work. And so we want to cultivate resilient forests, which are forests that are capable of maintaining their health and maintaining their natural processes throughout great stress and change, such as, but not limited to, what we expect to come as a result of climate change. In the long term, these resilient forests will also store more carbon and provide a lot of other benefits because they will be able to withstand large-scale disturbances, which will cause a large-scale release of carbon from the system. So we're allowing them to change, but we're crafting forests which have the tools to be healthy amidst change. So this is from an awesome publication called Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future by Tony D'Amato, Paul Cannizzaro, and Emily Huff. And this just says 4 goals of forest resiliency. So number 1, you keep forests forested and connected. So forests can't be resilient or do anything else if they're not forests anymore. So you ensure conserved forest cover, preferably on a bunch of different types of sites. Goal 2, reduce stressors. So limit the amount of stress that forests face, and that goes back to some of those things I mentioned as part of global change, that we've created all these additional stressors in addition to climate change that forests are facing that we can deal with. Goal number 3 is reducing vulnerability. So making the forest more resilient by establishing forests with complex structure. So all that means is trees which are more diverse, different sizes and ages of trees, which we'll talk about in a second, and reducing forest disturbances, which can also be accomplished by making forests which are more diverse, and to provide refuge, to maintain a maximum level of plant and animal diversity over time. So when I think about, how we manage forests to be resilient and how we manage forests to be healthy, what does it even mean for a forest to be healthy? I look to the clues that we have from old growth forests. So these might be old growth forests are forests that have been forests for a long period of time. It depends on who you ask, but a lot of people would say 150 years. Some people would say longer, like 300 years. And what's really cool about old growth forests is that they demonstrate what forests are like when they manage themselves. So they're forests growing in a way with, a bunch of different species subject to a bunch of different processes, but that have evolved as systems over a long period of time to be resilient. And so one of the really fascinating things about old growth forests is it's not about them resisting change. Actually, what I see as the most important part of how forests naturally grow and develop is change, is the fact that they're dynamic. And within small scale changes, they are stable as a system over time. So they resist big, huge, large scale disturbances most of the time, but they allow small scale disturbances to occur all the time. And actually, change in mortality in the forest is not sad or a bad thing at all. It's actually this incredible source of increased complexity in the forest. As the forest responds to mortality and disturbances, it creates a lot of really, really good things for the forest. So again, old growth forests, these are just forests which have developed without extensive disturbance for a long time, but which regularly are experiencing small scale disturbances. It depends on the definition that people use. A lot of people would say an old growth forest is older than 150 years old. Again, that doesn't mean that that every tree in the forest is over 150 years old. It means that the forest has not had an extensive, huge disturbance where like all the trees have fallen over or died in over 150 years. Prior to European settlement, this was a really, really important type of forest on our landscape, 55 to 60% in New England. And today it's less than 0.5%. In Vermont, we have maybe 1,000 acres total of old growth forest in a bunch of sort of smallish blocks. What are they like? So old growth forests, again, sort of this model that I'm using for judging what healthy forests look like and what resilient forests look like. Yes, there are big old trees, which is what we'd all expect, but there are also different trees of all different sizes and ages, what we call structural complexity or structural diversity, which just means different sizes and ages of trees. There is not a uniform canopy, which you can see right across and it's beautiful and perfect and it's the same everywhere. It's a canopy which is irregular and is punctuated with gaps and holes, which looks sort of like a very like crooked set of teeth with teeth missing, not just like a perfect set of teeth. If you were to look at it from the top, they have tons of dead wood everywhere. So dead wood, while to us it may look like really messy and something that we don't want to see, dead wood actually provides a lot of these really important habitat for organisms like invertebrates and fungi, which actually are like critical to the way that forests grow and develop, and also are just really, really provide hydrologic processes, support hydrologic processes in those old growth forests. They do all kinds of really important stuff. And there's dead wood everywhere. Dead trees of all different shapes and sizes and species, dead standing trees, dead wood on the ground, everything. A lot of times you'll see deep, well-developed soils. So that's just caused by the accumulation of that that biomass, those dead trees, that dead wood that's been deposited on the forest floor. And then as trees have tipped over, they've mixed those soils, so you get really deep, well-mixed soils. Pits and mounds are something we see. So this is just sort of, you'll see in an old growth forest, instead of a flat forest floor, you'll see these hummocks and then these divots. And what those are is where trees fell over and pulled up their root system with it, what we call a root ball. In the area where they pulled that out of, there's a dip, that's a pit. And the area where that root ball sat and then decomposed formed a mound. So you get this really weird hummocky appearance. And then you get a diverse composition. Composition just means the different species of trees. So lots of different species of trees, but generally dominated by our species of trees, which do better in the shade, right? Because we have usually smaller openings caused by the mortality of a tree or a few trees together, not these large scale openings, because these systems are generally relatively resistant to that kind of a disturbance. So in addition to resilient forests, we want adaptive forests. And so these are forests which cannot just maintain and be healthy in light of change and stress, but these are forests which are able to adapt and change themselves to do what they've done for thousands of years, but to perhaps do it more quickly as we present them with these fast-paced changes and these unknown future environmental conditions. So these are what I call forests managed for an uncertain future. And the way that we do that is very similar to the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of managing for resilient forests. So managing for a lot of different species of trees, managing for different sizes and ages of trees. I think about it as just giving the forest more tools in its toolkit to respond to whatever comes down the line. So for instance, if something happened, let's say this is a real thing that happens, something called forest tent caterpillar in Vermont, which is a native insect which attacks sugar maple trees. And we just sort of have finished an outbreak of forest tent caterpillar. If something like forest tent caterpillar comes along as a result of climate change, let's say it's a non-native species, and attacks sugar maples, and you've been managing your forest to be all sugar maples, like a sugar bush, like many people do, your forest is going to be disproportionately affected by that disturbance. Whereas if you've been managing your forest for a variety of different species, yes, you'll lose sugar maples from your forest, maybe, but it won't destabilize the forest as a whole because you'll have all these other species which will be not affected or not affected in the same way. Similarly, with trying to make forests that have a lot of different sizes and ages of trees, if you had a big windstorm, that might tip over all or most of the trees in the overstory of the forest, but it would leave the trees in those lower canopy layers, younger trees in the understory of the forest. And so again, you'd lose some part of your forest, some of the trees, but not everything. And so your forest would be able to sort of remain stable and healthy throughout those disturbances. And we don't know what those are going to be. And so just providing a lot of diversity is a good way to sort of hedge our bets. Take a sip of water. So I show these next two slides in almost every presentation that I do. And this is just acknowledging that everybody thinks that this forest looks really nice. So for some reason, and I don't know where it comes from, some people think it comes from us evolving like on the savanna. All of us like to see evenly spaced trees like this, big trees with nothing growing in the forest understory. You walk into a forest like this and you're like, wow, this looks really nice. It's just sort of this intuitive thing. And if you think that on some level, don't be ashamed of it. That's what everybody thinks. But healthy forests don't look like that. So again, healthy forests, as judged by, looking at the way that forests naturally grow and develop, and I'm using a lot of research about old growth forests to tell us that, because we have so little sort of natural forests on our landscape. Those old growth forests and what I would call healthy forests are dynamic, and they are not, they don't look neat and tidy. They look very messy. In this place, I'm standing right in front of these fallen over white pine trees and telling people why I think that this is a really, really good thing. So these are trees that have died, and yet in their dying, they are cultivating diversity, right? An opportunity for different species of trees to grow, to diversify the structure of that forest, a patch of young trees providing habitat for different wildlife species. This is an incredibly healthy process. And so what we often say is that messy is good, or that mess is best. Sometimes I'll go into a forest that's really diverse and I'll say, bless this mess, because really all of those things that look messy to us, most of those things that look messy to us are synonymous with ecosystem health and with resilience. So moving on to carbon. So basically, this is a way oversimplified version of the carbon cycle. But basically, the way that it works is that we've got all this carbon in the atmosphere, and we know that a lot of it comes from human-derived sources, that we're releasing it really rapidly into the atmosphere. But what plants do is, through the process of photosynthesis, they're not eating the light itself, but they're using the process of photosynthesis, which uses sunlight, to basically fix carbon out of the air. So they're grabbing carbon from carbon dioxide and they're turning that into plant material. So they're turning it into wood, they're turning it into roots, they're turning it into leaves. And it's sort of that process of photosynthesis is what facilitates that. And so what you'll see here is you have trees and plants capturing carbon in the air. They fix it into the tree and plant material. A lot of it ends up stored in the soil, and then as it decomposes, it gets re-released back into the atmosphere, and the cycle goes on and on. And obviously, we have broken this cycle by releasing the carbon, or we have seriously thrown a wrench into this cycle by releasing the carbon that has been stored in the ground for a really long time by the burning of fossil fuels and other stuff like that. So surprisingly, where does most of this carbon stored in the forest? Well, most of it, the vast majority of it in most forests, is stored in the soil. So if you look at this chart, and this is from 2017 from the Forest Inventory Analysis, FIA data, which is just this running inventory that's done on trees in Vermont and throughout the country, you'll see that soil organic carbon. So this is basically partially decomposed tree and plant material and animal material that's in the soil. That's 58% of all the carbon in the system. The forest floor and leaf litter, stuff like that, is about 6%. Down dead wood is 2%. Standing dead trees is 1%. And 33% is all living trees. So most of that carbon is just stored in the soil, which to a lot of people is very surprising. We think of, you walk into the forest and you think of these like huge, massive trees, and you're like, here's all that carbon, but actually a lot of it's just under your feet. When you cut trees and you create openings, one of the things that happens is that the increased temperature can basically lead to a lot of that carbon in the soil being metabolized. So in many cases, when we're trying to manage for carbon, we're trying to resist big openings in the forest, because that would cause a lot of that soil carbon to be very quickly digested and re-released as gaseous carbon. So this is a really cool graphic. Excuse me one second. We call it Forest Succession and Development Clock. And basically what this is charting is just a few different things, how they work in the forest over time. So here's the age of the forest. At 12 o'clock here is year 0. And then coming back around, you have year 100, year 200, 300, 400, back to 500. On this outer ring, or let me start actually with this green ring. So on this green ring, what it's showing is the rate at which carbon is sequestered over time in a forest. So in a forest, if the forest, this is not an individual tree, but a forest, when a forest is between 30 and like 70, 80 years old, it's sequestering carbon really quickly. So what that means is that it's sucking carbon out of the atmosphere really quickly because those trees are growing really fast. So in the case of like a big blowdown or a clear cut, you suddenly get a ton of different trees. They're all growing really fast between this time. And so they're photosynthesizing more, they're producing more wood, more plant material, they're fixing more carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, for a long time, this was sort of a dog whistle to the forest management industry in a way, because they were saying, well, if we want to sequester carbon really quickly, we need to create more clear cuts, right? We need to create these areas of young forest just to capture this really intense time of carbon sequestration. So you see that here's this maximum time when this color green is the darkest, and then as the forest gets older and older and older, it's sequestering less carbon. Okay, so that seems like it makes sense until you consider this outer ring where it's brown. So this is changes in carbon storage over time in the system. So at year zero, again, because of the way that I talked about, after a large scale disturbance, a lot of that soil organic carbon, the carbon in the soil has been metabolized, digested, and turned back into carbon dioxide. Um, Here at year zero, we have very little carbon or no carbon, or it wouldn't be no carbon, but very little carbon stored in the system. And the rate of carbon storage, so this is the total amount of carbon storage in the system, increases steadily over time. And it's still increasing as we're here at year 500, right? And so when you make a big clear cut, you may have, created some really fast carbon sequestration, but you haven't stored that carbon. You're just sucking it out of the atmosphere. And when your forest gets 80 years old and you clear cut it again, here you are back at year zero and you haven't stored any carbon. And so it's really, really important that we are both balancing forests that sequester carbon very quickly because we want to suck that carbon out of the atmosphere, but we also then want to store that carbon in forests. And the best way to store it is by avoiding those large-scale disturbances. So how do we manage for forest carbon, not just on an individual property level, but across the landscape? So this is the big picture of everywhere. How do we store more forest carbon? We avoid deforestation. So we avoid losing forests because forests can't store carbon or do anything else if they're no longer forests. That's the most important thing and the most intrinsic threat to our forests. Okay, so yeah, so avoiding deforestation, fragmentation, parcelization. How do we do that? By conserving land, by protecting, which is conservation with a big C, conserving land with a conservation easement that protects it forever, or otherwise protecting it. And also by advocating for keeping forests as forests in our communities with planning and zoning. So creating planning and zoning that's protecting our forests from being developed, protecting big forested blocks, protecting our forests as big chunks of forest land, and concentrating the development of our communities in clusters and in areas that are already developed. We can also promote managing for forest carbon across our landscape by promoting forest management that improves climate resiliency and adaptation. So healthy, resilient forests are going to be able to sequester and store more carbon in the long term. Managing forests, as I'll talk about in a second, when you manage a forest, you're probably going to lower the amount of carbon in that system in the short term. But if you create a forest that's more resilient and adaptive, you're going to set that forest up to sequester and store more carbon in the long term. And also, I don't think anybody sort of in the forest management world wants to hear this, but also allowing areas to be unmanaged is also really important. So recognizing that old growth forests are something that are underrepresented across our landscape, and they store a lot of carbon. And in addition to providing really important ecosystem services and wildlife habitat that are not provided by younger forests, they are just worthy of being protected. So how do we do this on an individual forest level? So one way is to let trees get older. So even if we are doing harvesting, even if we are doing active management, increasing what we call rotation length. So that just means, if we're harvesting a lot of trees when they reach an age of like 100, if we instead harvest them when they're reaching 120, that difference equates to additional carbon in that system. I also, in my management, while I'm sometimes cutting big trees, I'm also retaining a lot of big old trees, which I call biological legacy trees. And their job, if you want to think about it that way, or what they're doing for the forest is just to be big trees. I'm never going to harvest them. They're not Their job isn't to be valuable and to accrue more value. Their job is just to be big trees and to provide those ecological benefits of big trees. And those big trees are storing a lot of carbon and continue to sequester and store carbon to a very old age. Also leaving lots of dead wood behind. So not picking up every little piece of wood on the ground is really, really important. That dead wood is carbon, which is going to become soil organic carbon in addition to just richness in the soils that you want, fertility that you want to grow future generations of trees, in addition to other stuff like microinvertebrates and fungi and salamanders and all sorts of other cool stuff. You want to manage your individual forest to increase diversity and complexity, which we're going to talk about in a second, and to address forest health, like invasive exotic plants and deer overpopulations. So there may be active things that you can do that aren't intuitive, like aggressively, killing invasives with herbicide and killing deer and stuff like that. That seems like it would fly in the face of managing for healthy forests, but in a lot of cases, these sort of counterintuitive things are some of the hard choices that we really want to and need to make to protect our forests long term in a changing climate. And we can talk more about that in the questions section if you want. And so I think about it when we're managing for forest carbon, and we're having this conversation about that, I think about quantity and quality. So the quantity is that we want to manage forests that sequester and store a lot of carbon, right? That should say sequester and store a lot of carbon. But at the same time, we want to manage forests which are adaptive, which are resilient, and which provide really great habitat for all of our native organisms. So it goes back to reframing, just thinking about climate change, and to also thinking about global change. So at the same time that, storing carbon is something that's really important to protect our world and to protect our ecosystems, we also know that there are other things which are not the same, which are also really important. So an example of that is providing habitat for our native organisms. So our landscapes are not like they were 300 years ago, and as a result, we have forests which are less diverse and which are provide habitat in a different way than those forests did hundreds of years ago. And so the steps that we take to provide qualitatively functional landscapes, so landscapes that have like a rich array of different habitat types for all of Vermont's native wildlife, and which are addressing other threats to our biodiversity that are occurring for different reasons because of, development and forest loss and stuff like that, those may not always be the same techniques that would store the maximum amount of carbon in the system over time. So biodiversity is an example of something that is really, really important, that is severely threatened by global change. It's something that I would argue has intrinsic importance. So it's biodiversity, the ability of all of these different organisms to live on our landscape, is something that I think anyone would say that these organisms have a right to exist. Biodiversity is also, though, a tool. It's a tool to help our forests be more adaptive and resilient for all those reasons we talked about before, that this diversity really, really, really is a good way, encouraging diversity in our forests is in a good way to make them sort of buffered from all these massive changes that we think are coming down the pike. And so protecting biodiversity in a context of global change, again, might require using tools that are not optimum forest carbon, but which are sort of in balance, trying to make our forests and our landscapes sequester a lot of carbon at the same time that we're also like providing amazing habitat and protecting our biodiversity. So I call this managing for ecologically healthy or ecologically functional landscapes. So, there are steps that we can take to manage our landscapes actively, doing stuff like managing our young, simple forest, which is almost all of our forests are relatively young and relatively simple compared to the forests that dominated our landscape just a few hundred years ago, make them more resilient, diverse, and complex. We can also create pockets of habitat underrepresented across the landscape. So in some cases, that might mean making bigger openings, making like a 5-acre patch cut or something like that, because we know that in addition to our forests not being as diverse as forests were a few hundred years ago, that our landscapes also don't have the same mix of different habitat types and forest ages as they did a few hundred years ago. And as a result, we don't have habitat for, the species that really depend on some of these different habitat types. So an example of that is young forest. which to create young, or what we call early successional forest, you have to make big openings. And we don't have enough of those on our landscape. So while making a big opening is a bad way to manage for carbon, it might be a great way to manage for some of these native species that we want to protect. We also, at the same time that we're doing that, it doesn't need to be all of any one thing. We also, again, want to allow some forests to be unmanaged, because that's also a feature that is, in this case, more carbon positive and also providing landscape level diversity. And we want to address landscape level threats like development, forest loss, etc. So the goal is to make our landscapes more resilient, making our landscapes more diverse, making our landscapes sequester and store more carbon, while also making them more sort of ecologically functional. So I would be remiss if I didn't show you this. So this is a graph. You don't need to understand what all this means, but this is basically a graph from, I think, a 2009 paper by Jared Nunnery and Bill Keaton at UVM. And what they did is basically model out the amount of carbon stored in a system under all different kinds of management scenarios. So, there's, with different harvesting frequencies. So there's these different systems that have different levels of intensity and different levels of retention, amount of trees they're leaving behind, et cetera. And you don't need to know what all these are, but you do need to know that this top line is no management. So no management will almost always be the optimum carbon scenario. Now, what that means is that, anytime that we're creating disturbances, or anytime that disturbance occurs, that is an opportunity for carbon to be lost from that system. Again, as trees die and are digested, and that soil carbon and the carbon in that tree is reconverted into carbon dioxide. What this does not account for is, number one, the resilience of a forest. So it could be that by actively managing our forests to be more diverse, which we think will make them more resilient and more adaptive in this changing climate over the long term, while in the short term, we're going to be losing some carbon from that system. In the long term, we're going to be creating a system which is more capable of storing carbon and sequestering carbon in the long term. What it also doesn't show is that this graphic has been used by some to justify why we should never be harvesting any wood. And if you talk to Bill Keaton at UVM about it, that wasn't his intention at all. What he's saying is that there are different levels of harvesting retention, there are different levels of harvesting intensity, and that there are tools that you can use that can, that we can try and employ to use our management to get closer and closer to this red line. So, allowing different levels of tension to occur, like I'm talking about with allowing trees to get older, keeping big trees in the forest, etc. Allowing some areas to be unmanaged that can help push us up and allow us to create these landscapes that are more resilient and more diverse at the same time that we're storing a ton of carbon in the system. And so the type of forestry that I practice involves active management. It involves cutting trees. But instead of basing it on, sort of traditional, or what is called, to my chagrin, scientific forestry, which is basically managing forests to produce wood and to produce economic value as quickly and efficiently as possible, what ecological forestry tries to do is to manage forests like they manage themselves. So instead of managing forests as like wood farms, we're managing forests as complex systems which include trees, but are also not limited to trees. So this means that we're managing whole, complete ecosystems within which all the parts are important. So we're managing trees at the same time that we're managing salamanders and microinvertebrates and fungi and insects and arthropods and all these different mosses and lichens and bryophytes, all these different things, and recognizing that all of these different things are important, and that we can interact with forests in a way that is positive by basing the way we're interacting with them on natural disturbances, on the way that forests naturally grow and develop as systems. So, I'll talk about what that looks like in a second. And also what old growth forests look like, and also sort of taking a restorative approach. So saying, because our landscapes are already so altered by humans, maybe there's a role for us in helping our forests recover from that and become more like natural forests, which are also more resilient and have more diverse wildlife habitat and a bunch of other stuff that we really want to encourage. Within ecological forestry, I also specifically practice a type of forestry which tries to restore these old growth characteristics. So again, we are trying to use logging, to use active forest management to simulate natural disturbances and the natural forest successional processes to make our forests. We can't make forest old growth forests sooner than old growth forests can make themselves, but we can make our forest old growthier, and we can make the conditions of old growth forests, stuff like having big trees, having different sizes and ages of trees, having lots of dead wood everywhere. We can make those features occur sooner than they would naturally, and those features have value. And those features are used by a huge array of different organisms and by forested systems as a whole, and cannot make themselves faster than we can make them, if that makes sense. And so we're managing in general, instead of for regularity, like that idyllic picture of that forest that looks like a park, instead of managing for uniformity and regularity, we're managing for complexity, irregularity, what I call weirdness. We're managing for many different sizes, ages, species of trees, creating proactively gaps in the canopy, leaving tons of dead wood in the forest, retaining and recruiting big old legacy trees just to be big trees and afford to the forest all the benefits of big trees, and then eventually to be big dead trees, which are by some measures equally or more important than big trees. And so by doing all those things, we're managing forests, we're helping our relatively young forests be more like old growth forests, which is something that I would argue has intrinsic value, but all these really positive climate benefits, helping our forests be more resilient and adaptive and to store more carbon. The other thing that I really think about, and more and more, sort of the traditional role of the forester, the old school role of the forester, is that you're basically about wood procurement. More recently, foresters are more about, sort of managing forests in a more holistic way. And there's a lot of foresters who are managing forests with this sort of ecological approach and creating, really doing amazing work, sort of healing our forests or restoring them, doing forest management that is regenerative and not just extractive. However, something that we need to think about, which is something that none of us want to think about who love forests and love trees, is the fact that cutting trees, the killing of trees, might in some way embody positive changes that we want to see in the world. So a major way that we're going to mitigate climate change is not just through the way we manage our forests, but changing how we create and use resources fundamentally. So local resources alone is really important thing to support. I would argue is radical to support because it means that we have more control over the environmental and social impacts. That also means of our resource consumption and extraction. So that also means that we have to bear some of those impacts. So it means that while it may be uncomfortable to see the forests around us change and start to look messy because they've been recently managed, we have to become comfortable with that because the alternative to that is consuming resources from somewhere else where we don't have control over the environmental social impacts and where those impacts are much greater. We get to keep the positive parts of resource extraction at home. So supporting the livelihoods of our communities, supporting the character of our communities and our working landscapes, and we avoid having those unknown negative impacts elsewhere. So, environmental racism and environmental injustice are things that are real. And in many cases, when we say not in my backyard, what we're saying is, okay, but in someone else's backyard where those people don't have the privilege to say that. And so that's one of the reasons why I think, people who the cutting of trees makes them uncomfortable, but they're still willing to say, I know that I'm going to say yes to this because it is, it embodies other things that I want to see in the world, is really, really radical and important. Using renewable resources, which wood is, instead of non-renewable resources, I also think is just really powerful and it's just a way to lower our impacts. And again, sometimes when we're saying no to local renewable resources, we're saying yes to non-local, non-renewable resources, which is much worse. We just don't necessarily have to deal with the impacts of it in as direct of a way. And it also helps people, in Vermont, where we have this incredible what I call the great experiment of most of our forests, 80% of our forest, and this huge portion of our landscape being owned by private landowners, allowing those landowners to make a little money to help pay their property taxes, which they pay thousands of dollars of every year, and you know, they also are providing, you know, as a whole, all of these private land massive benefits to us, providing all of our wildlife habitat and all of our carbon sequestration and storage and habitat for our pollinators and clean air and clean water. It's okay for them to make a little bit of money or to cut some firewood sometimes. And so I think that, you know, in some ways with a lot of these benefits, and I'll usually have a slide like this in most presentations that I do, because in a lot of ways, while cutting trees may be something that we think of as regressive, or, you know, flies in the face of things that we care about, like carbon, you know, managing forests for climate change and forest carbon or wildlife habitat, in some ways, in the big picture, actually cutting trees and producing local renewable resources in a responsible way, especially, you know, managing forests in this ecological context, can be really powerful and can actually be a greater both local and global benefit than not doing that. So here are some resources which are really cool and really accessible and easy to read. All three of them are by these two really amazing guys, Tony D'Amato at UVM and Paul Catanzaro at UMass. And the middle one is also by Emily Silver Huff. And these are all resources which I'm happy to provide links to. They're all quick, they're all easy, digestible, etc. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take some questions.
So we did have one question in the chat a little earlier when you were showing the carbon measurement slide about to what depth were the soil carbon measurements and how does the carbon concentration change with depth? And I will also just make the note that I did put it on so that people can't unmute themselves. Give me just a second to change that setting. And then if people do have questions that they don't feel like typing, you can use that raise your hand button. So just give me a second.
Depth, yep. To what depth were the soil carbon measurements? How does the carbon concentration change with depth? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I assume that it's meant to be total carbon in the system. So, and I would assume that, you know, as you're towards the top layer of the soil, you're looking at more soil carbon because that's where there's going to be more tree root mass, and that's where more of that soil organic carbon that's been deposited is not going to be able to work its way down to the deepest levels of the soil, and the lower levels of the soil are going to be primarily mineral. But I assume that those, you know, usually soil carbon is calculated in stuff like I've been talking about, is calculated by modeling. And I think that it's meant to mean total soil carbon, not soil carbon to a specific depth. Catherine also asked, I would imagine that no management, if there are invasive plants like common buckthorn that suppress native tree regeneration, would store less carbon than a forest that is managed to control invasive species. Yeah, I think that that is true. I mean, I think that one of the things about these invasive plants is that they lower biodiversity in the forest, which is going to lower sort of like what I would think of as the qualitative benefits of the forest, the ability of the forest to respond to disturbances and regenerate and produce amazing wildlife habitat. And part of that regeneration is future generations of trees. So most of these invasive plants like honeysuckle and buckthorn are not going to become full-size trees. And so because they're not becoming full-size trees, the forest in the long term, if they're heavily infested, are not going to be able to sequester and store as much carbon. So yeah, so I think that really, you know, sometimes it's sort of a hard leap to make, but the more we learn about all these things we want to encourage in the forest, the more we learn that they're all linked. And so managing for biodiversity in the forest, in my mind, is very similar to managing for climate resiliency and to managing for carbon, because we know that diverse forests are going to be healthier long term, and healthier forests are going to store more carbon. And so anything that stands in the way of a forest's ability to regenerate and to create new generations of trees and to respond to disturbances like invasive plants do is going to be a fundamental threat to its ability to store carbon, if not in the short term, in the long term. Ellie asked, how do you feel about the introduction of black locust to our forests? Black locust is really weird, Ellie. On some sites, in particular, I see this on like deep sandy soils. On some sites, it can be very, very invasive. So it's a species that's native to North America, but not native to this part, and was widely introduced as a source of fuel wood. It's also was used as a living fence because it's thorny, so they would plant along your fence lines, and then you could also harvest it periodically because it's rot resistant to use as fence posts. And then finally, because it's a legume, it can fix aerial nitrogen, so grab nitrogen out of the air and deposit it into the soil, so it enriches soils as well. So yeah, so I with black locust in areas where it is behaving invasively, so like on those sandy soils, I treat it just like buckthorn or honeysuckle or anything like that. In a lot of sites that aren't like that, I think of it as a species which is uh, not native, or it's like native-ish, but is naturalized. And if it's not behaving invasively, I'm not concerned about it. I don't see it spreading across the landscape in the way that buckthorn or honeysuckle does. But again, on those sandy sites, I have seen it be very aggressive. Mary Wigmore said, extending rotation and retaining older trees at high stocking levels will change the nature of our timber harvest. Can we get the industry to go along with this? En masse, we have been cutting hard and heavy with songbird cuts, and I'm worried about how to integrate the silvicultural criteria for max carbon storage and uptake in your ideas. Are there suggested ratios for no disturbance reserve sites for optimal carbon storage units and management zones across the landscape? Is anybody looking at that for research? So there may be, I'm not aware of anything like that in terms of those specific ratios. I know that in Vermont, we would love to get 9% of our forests to be old growth forests, but that's from a habitat perspective. So that's to preserve old growth habitat. And again, we have like 0.5% of our landscape is that. So that would be, it would be 9% of our forest, which would be like 6.7% of our landscape or something like that. Extending rotation and retaining older trees at high stocking levels. So like, I guess what Mary's question is how do we get like the forest products industry, which is such an important partner in all this management work that we do. They're not like bad people. Loggers aren't bad people. Mills aren't bad people. How do we get these people to adopt these sort of strategies of managing for more carbon? I think that the tool that we can use that, or I guess let me put it to you this way. In my experience with managing this way, you don't actually have to sacrifice that much value. You just have to sort of approach it in a different way. So yes, you're leaving some big trees, some value in the woods. Yes, you're not harvesting all your trees at once. You're just harvesting smaller portions of a forest at one time. So like instead of creating big 5-acre clear cuts, you're creating, half-acre openings, quarter-acre openings, sometimes an acre opening. I think that actually that wouldn't be that hard of a change to make in the way that we do things. I think it would just be sort of a cultural shift. And I think that there's, in my experience, working with bloggers, especially with mills, they don't mind doing that. And a lot of this is portions of this are already happening, but what it's just not doing is it's not happening sort of institutionally. And I think it could. It would be a mindset shift, but I don't think it would have to change their operating procedures sort of holistically. And there are also, I think that you could take portions of this. So like a lot of the wood in our country is not from, little family forests like we have here in Vermont mostly, but is from large scale, like massive plantations, in Maine and New Brunswick and in the American Southeast with loblolly pine and the American Northwest with Douglas fir. And so if you just allowed a little bit more diversity in the species that are growing there instead of just growing one species. And if you allowed a little bit more diversity in terms of instead of just, having massive plantings and then massive clear cuts, but harvested them in smaller pockets, just by doing that, you would massively increase the resilience and the carbon storage of that system. Would that be slightly inconvenient? Probably, but I think it would be worth it. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say about that. And again, I'm employing this strategy in the context of commercial logging. So I do these demonstration projects on, about 2 years I did at the Heinsberg Town Forest. Right now I've got one going at the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, which if you want to learn more about it, shoot me an email. And I'm doing lots of education and outreach around it. And yeah, it takes a little bit to explain to the logger why we're not cutting every single big oak, but doesn't end up being a massive inconvenience or anything like that. And it doesn't mean that the jobs we're doing are no longer commercial. Michael says, I've heard that harvesting half a quart of firewood per forested acre is a good rule of thumb. Comment, is this too general? It's a good rule of thumb. So, if you're thinking about the amount of carbon or biomass that you have in your forest, it varies widely, but if you're harvesting half a quart of firewood per acre, you're probably harvesting about what that forest is growing in a given year. So you're not lowering the amount of carbon in your forest as represented by growing trees in a given year. So that it is general, but it's a good rule of thumb. And Doug asked, if forest carbon and health are primary goals, should warmer southern species be introduced now given climate change? So that's a really interesting question. What we call assisted migration. And very, very sort of contentious. I don't feel fully qualified to talk about it. But I know that there are people who are interested in that. And I would say that the way that that is expressing itself in the way that a lot of us who are concerned about the effect of climate change on our forests, the way that we're doing that is by, sort of favoring species in our management that we expect to be more successful. So an example of this is red oak. So red oak is a species that we're just sort of on the northern end of its range here. But we expect it to become more prominent over time. So we don't have to, take acorns and drive them, 300 miles north, but we can, in our management, really try and regenerate red oak and retain a lot of red oak. Same thing with some of our other species like our hickories, other species that were just sort of on the northern edge of its range, but we expect them to become more prominent. We can, in the course of the management that we're doing anyway, just try and favor those species. We can thin around them. We can create conditions that are optimum for their regeneration, etc. But there are people who are taking a more active role and actually are trying to facilitate that migration. But I don't know enough about that to speak about that except in sort of in a general way. Mary said, how do you decide where to implement the OGC sites? Do you pick up areas with some of these characteristics already? No, I don't, Mary. So where do I decide how to do that sort of old growth characteristics, the management to make our younger forests more like old growth forests? I do them on every forest that I work on. So there are already opportunities, in some cases, if you go into an area that already has some big trees or that already has, different sizes and ages of trees or already has really cool, dead wood that's on the forest floor for some reason, that can be really handy, but you got to start somewhere. And so a lot of ways, what I approach, let's say a young forest that is all trees that are about the same size and about the same age, where you start is you start by creating some disturbances. So, creating pockets where you're going to cut all the trees or most of the trees in a little area, which will create some regeneration, and there's a new age class of trees. You can start by thinning around individual trees that you're going to recruit to be those future legacy trees. And so you're going to grow them to that larger size faster on purpose, just so that they can be big trees. And you can do this really anywhere. Yeah, so it started to be that at first I thought that everybody just did ecological forestry and that, why wouldn't people leave big trees and why wouldn't people do this kind of work? And then I realized that this is something that does happen, that is being done by foresters, maybe not explicitly all the time, but is being done by foresters, but that most people aren't doing it all the time and doing it explicitly and specifically talking about it in this way. And so now I've just really started to lean into it because I'm sort of like, why in the world wouldn't we want to manage forests how they grow? You know, why would I want to go out there and use logging to create a condition which is completely unrepresentative of any condition that a forest would naturally find itself in? I want to, you know, instead of just trying to reinvent this system and, you know, the interactions between these species, which have been developing for thousands of years, why don't we harness the natural resilience of the system to grow forests which are going to be really healthy? And so that's what I do all the time now. What changes, Lee asked, what changes, if any, are needed in current use regulations to encourage more landowner interest in carbon sequestration? So I know that there's been, I get asked about this a lot. So I know that there's been some talk about, you know, some people wishing that we could manage for carbon. You know, and so let me back up. So in the current use program, the use value appraisal program, which is that tax abatement program that I manage, one of the caveats is that you have to manage your land actively. So you have to manage your land for the production of timber in some way over the long term. That doesn't mean that you gotta every 10 years you gotta clear cut your forest, but it means that the expectation is that you'll manage your forest actively when it's appropriate to do so. And so, you know, what that can look like can take many forms. So I have land that's in current use, and I manage it actively for greater carbon sequestration and storage. And it's not in conflict in any way with the work that I'm doing, which is, you know, the active management, which is completely compliant with current use. So it's really important that I explain to people, like, you can leave big trees. You don't have to cut every tree when it gets big. You can do management, active management, where you're trying to maximize your forest's ability to sequester and store carbon. You just can't, in the program right now, you just can't do that option, which is like, I'm never going to manage my forest because I'm sequestering and storing, or I'm storing carbon, right? That is something that I think that there are a lot of people in the state, or there are some people, vocal people in the state, who want to be able to do that, who want to be able to say, you know, I should be able to not manage my forest. And of course, we love old forests, and like I said, I want to see more old forests across our landscape. Um, but we can't do that right now. That would require a legislative change in the program, which maybe will happen someday, but you can't do it right now. What else we got? Catherine asked a question about how late in the winter is cut stump glyphosate treatment of invasives effective. So probably don't have time to really get into the whole invasives thing right now, but you know, something in to restore our forests and protect our biodiversity, using herbicide in like a very specific, targeted, minimal way is something that I've become comfortable with, because people who don't use herbicide normally don't address invasive species problems. And so in order to address this problem, which we really, really need to for a ton of different reasons, I advocate for that. I tell people how to do it. I have a video on my YouTube channel that talks about how to do it. And so, yeah, that cut stump treatment, if you want to look up that video, I use this thing called a buckthorn blaster, which is like a pretty cool tool. And Catherine, you can do that treatment pretty much June through February. So you don't want to do it in those early spring months, early summer months when that sap is really running, because it'll just push the herbicide right off the surface of the stump. Ellie, you have your hand up. Do you mean to have your hand up? Do you want to ask a question? You're muted, so you gotta mute yourself if you wanna.
No, I don't have a question. It was a mistake.
Okay. Another question. This will be the last question that I answer. Just to respect everybody's time. Mary asked, is the balance of the max sequestration rate, forest structure, and the max carbon storage forest structure intuitive? Meaning that if we practice single tree selection with small gaps, will we approach the balanced composition in our usual? So I have to think about that for a second. I guess I don't think I understand that question, Mary. Is the balance of the max sequestration rate forest structure and the max carbon storage forest structure. Oh, I see what you're saying. Intuitive. So the max is the max. So the maximum carbon sequestration rate for a structure is a 30-year-old forest. So like a clear cut that is 30 years old is the maximum carbon sequestration, 30 through 70 years old. The maximum carbon storage for a structure is where we get into that more complex, like an older forest. So an older, a 500-year-old forest, which will be very complex and have lots of dead wood and have lots of soil carbon and stuff like that, will be the most carbon storage. So those are obviously like opposite things. Now, you can have both of those things by having small gaps with young trees in them and, having areas that are relatively undisturbed. But yeah. So Mary asks, how do we use that forest succession and development clock? Well, when you get into the woods marking. So basically, I think the best way to do it is by trying to create forests which are more diverse and more complex. So forests which have many different sizes and ages of trees without creating those large-scale disturbances, unless we're trying to create like those pockets of young forest habitat that we need on our landscape, right? So what that clock illustrates is that we want to have both young trees and we want to have old forests. So in order to have young trees, we need to create some openings. Those are those areas that are going to sequester carbon really fast. And to have old forests, we need to avoid like large scale, huge disturbance. And in doing so, we're going to store a lot of carbon at the same time. That would be what I would say about that. Yeah. So I guess with that, and I hope that answers your question, Mary. Mary, if you have more questions about that, send me an email, and I'll answer that offline. But I want to get off of here so I can respect everybody's time.
Yeah, everybody, thank you all so much for attending. It's been really great to be able to offer this series of webinars with Ethan. I will post the recording, hopefully next week. It takes a while, like I mentioned earlier, to get the video sort of downloaded and edited and all that, but I will send out an email when that is posted to our page. Thank you all so much. I'll be sending a survey out tomorrow as well, just wanting to know sort of what you thought of this event and whether you have any ideas for other classes that you'd like to see virtually. But you can click that little red leave button in the top corner of Teams. And thank you all so much for attending. I'll end the meeting in just a few minutes, but have a good night, everybody. Thank you.